Imagine this. I want you to just, for a moment, picture yourself standing on a street corner in Sarajevo.
Okay.
It's a Sunday morning, June 28th, 1914. The sun is absolutely blazing down on the Apple Quay, which it runs right along the river there.
It's hot, humid.
Yeah, the air is thick, but there's a kind of festive vibe going on. You've got flags out. It's the Feast of St. Vitus, which is a huge deal for Serbian nationalists. And down the road, you see a motorcade approaching.
And this isn't just any motorcade. In the second car, an open-topped one, a Greffen-Stiff double phaeton, if you want the details, sits Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
The heir.
The heir to the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's in full military dress, hat with these, big green ostrich feathers. And next to him is his wife, Sophie.
No, this is where the story gets almost cinematic, because this couple, they've already survived one assassination attempt that exact morning.
Right. A bomb was thrown at their car.
A bomb. It literally bounced off the folded down roof of their convertible, rolled under the car behind them, and exploded. Injured a bunch of people.
So you'd think, at that point, you'd call it a day.
You would think. Go back to the hotel, lock the doors, maybe order some room service. But they don't. They decide to continue the tour.
It's this incredible mix of, imperial arrogance and maybe a genuine sense of duty.
Yeah.
They decided, okay, we'll change the plan. We'll go visit the people who were wounded in the hospital.
A noble gesture. But here's the fatal mistake. Nobody tells the driver.
The driver's not from Sarajevo. He's just following the original route that's in his head.
So he makes a wrong turn. A literal wrong turn. He's supposed to go straight down the quay, but he hangs a right onto Franz Joseph Street. And the whole course of the 20th century pivots on a guy getting lost.
The governor of Bosnia, who's in the car with them, starts yelling, "What's this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight."
So the driver realizes his mistake. He slams on the brakes to reverse. The gears of this old car just crunch and grind, and the engine stalls.
It stalls right in front of a delicatessen, Schiller's Delicatessen.
And who just happens to be loitering there, probably grabbing a sandwich, thinking his one big chance for the day was gone.
A 19-year-old high school student, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip.
He sees his chance. It's a gift from fate. He steps up onto the running board of the car, which is maybe 5 feet away from him. He raises a pistol.
He fires 2 shots. One hits the Archduke in the jugular, the other hits Sophie in the abdomen.
And in that moment, with those 2 pistol shots, the 19th century effectively comes to a violent end. The entire modern world, our world of total war, of crumbling empires, the map of Europe as we kind of know it, it's born in that flash of gunpowder and blood.
It's the shot heard around the world, for sure. But here's the real problem, and it's why we're doing this deep dive today.
Yeah.
We always tell this story like it's a freak accident.
The ultimate butterfly effect.
Exactly. We focus on the wrong turn, the stalled car, the pure dumb luck of it all. And we think, wow, if only the driver had just kept going straight, World War I never would have happened.
It's a comforting thought in a way. It makes the catastrophe seem avoidable.
But that view is just dangerously incomplete. Gavrilo Princip didn't start the war in a vacuum. He wasn't just some lone actor. He didn't just fire a pistol. He dropped a lit match into a warehouse that had been meticulously stacked, floor to ceiling, with gunpowder for 40 years.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We're not just looking at the spark in Sarajevo. We're going to take a long walk through that warehouse. We need to unpack the July crisis, that absolutely frantic month of diplomatic blunders and posturing that followed the assassination.
But to really understand that, you have to go back. You have to look at the machinery that was built over decades, the alliances, the insecurities, the arms races, the petty rivalries, all the things that made that explosion not just possible, but maybe even inevitable.
We've got a great set of sources to help us navigate this. We're using the AQA history specifications for the sort of structural skeleton of the story. We've got academic articles on things like the naval blockade and food supply to understand the real-world consequences.
And we're drawing on excerpts from some of the historical heavyweights. People like Fritz Fischer, who completely changed the debate, John Keegan, and of course, Christopher Clark's incredible book, The Sleepwalkers.
And the so what here is just, it's massive. This isn't just dusty history about old empires and men with complicated mustaches. This moment redefined how the world works. It destroyed 4 ancient empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman.
It birthed the Soviet Union. It set the stage for American global dominance. And it introduced the terrifyingly modern concept of total war, where the home front is as much a target as the battlefield.
Honestly, if you want to understand the modern Middle East or the conflicts in the Balkans or even why the United Nations exists, you have to understand why the dominoes fell the way they did in that one summer in 1914.
Absolutely. You can't understand the 20th century at all without understanding why the 19th century effectively committed suicide.
Okay, so let's build the bomb before we light the fuse. We have to rewind the clock. We're going back to 1871. The Franco-Prussian War has just ended. What is the vibe in Europe at that moment?
The vibe is seismic. The tectonic plates of European power have just shifted violently. Before 1871, Germany, as we think of it didn't exist as a single country. It was this patchwork of dozens of independent states, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony.
A geographic expression, not a nation.
Exactly. But Prussia, led by this absolute titan of a figure, Otto von Bismarck, has just smashed France in a war. I mean, smashed them. They captured the French emperor. They besieged Paris.
And then they did something incredibly provocative.
Oh, it's the ultimate power move. In January 1871, while their troops are still essentially occupying the country, the leaders of the German states gather in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles.
In the enemy's most sacred palace.
And they proclaim the new German Empire.
Yeah.
It was a calculated act of supreme humiliation that France would never, ever forget. But practically speaking, it meant a new giant had just been born, right in the heart of Europe.
So overnight, you have this massive, unified, industrialized, militarized superpower. How did the neighbors react to that?
With absolute terror. France to the west is burning with a desire for revenge, or revanche. They've lost two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. Russia to the east is wary. Austria-Hungary to the south, who Prussia had defeated just a few years earlier, is now in a very awkward position.
So this brings us to Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. We have this image of him as this aggressive warmonger, the guy of blood and iron.
And that's true. For the period of unification, he absolutely started wars when he needed to. But, and this is the crucial pivot point you have to understand, once Germany is unified in 1871, Bismarck's entire game changes.
He becomes a man of peace.
Sort of. A man of precarious peace. He becomes what one historian called the ventriloquist of Varzin, named after his country estate. He realizes that Germany is now a satiated power. It has what it wants. Its biggest threat isn't failing to expand, it's being destroyed.
Because it's stuck in the middle.
Right in the middle. No natural borders to the east or west. And his absolute nightmare, the thing that genuinely kept him up at night, was what he called the cauchemar des coalitions, the nightmare of coalitions.
Being surrounded.
Being crushed in a vice. Specifically, a two-front war. If France, desperate for revenge, ever teamed up with the Russian giant, Germany would be doomed. So for the next 20 years, Bismarck's entire foreign policy is a masterpiece of diplomatic juggling designed to do one thing: keep France isolated.
Okay, so he builds this web of alliances. Let's try and untangle it, because looking at it on paper, some of these deals seem, well, they seem to contradict each other.
They absolutely did. That was the genius and ultimately the fragility of his system. It all depended on him personally to manage the contradictions. So first up, in 1873, he forms the Dreikaiserbund.
The League of the Three Emperors.
Right. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia.
It's like a club for autocrats. We all hate democracy and liberalism. Let's hang out.
That was part of it, for sure. It was an ideological front against republicanism. But the real strategic purpose was to prevent Austria and Russia from killing each other.
Over the Balkans.
Always over the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe, was crumbling. And both Vienna and St. Petersburg were looking at those territories hungrily, wanting to expand their influence. Bismarck knew a war between them would be a disaster for Germany, so his job was to be the honest broker, to keep them talking to Berlin instead of shooting at each other.
Okay, so he's got the two eastern giants in a fragile truce. What about his western flank?
Well, his main goal is isolating France.
Huh.
But he strengthens his position in the center. In 1879, he signs the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. This is the absolute bedrock of his system. It's a defensive pact.
So if Russia attacks one of you,
the other comes to their aid. That's a clear message to St. Petersburg. Don't even think about it. Then Italy, who was also nervous about France, joins in 1882, making it the Triple Alliance.
So he's got Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy all locked down. But wait, if he's got an alliance with Austria against a potential Russian attack, how does he keep Russia from feeling threatened and running straight to France?
That is the masterstroke. That is the most precarious, brilliant, and ultimately doomed piece of the puzzle. It's called the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887.
And this was a secret deal.
Top secret, just between Germany and Russia. And it was fiendishly complex, but the gist was this. They both promised to remain neutral if the other got into a war with a third power.
Hold on. So he's telling Austria, don't worry, we've got your back against Russia. But he's secretly telling Russia, hey, if you get into a scrap with, say, Austria, we'll probably just stay out of it.
It was juggling with glass balls on a high wire. He was banking on his own diplomatic genius to make sure a situation where those two treaties directly contradicted each other would never actually rise. As long as he was the ventriloquist, the puppets wouldn't get their strings tangled. The whole point was to keep Russia tied to Berlin, no matter how loosely, to prevent them from calling Paris.
It sounds absolutely exhausting just describing it.
It was, and it worked. For 20 years, it kept the peace.
Yeah.
But the system had a fatal flaw.
It depended entirely on one man.
Exactly. And that man was about to get fired. Enter the agent of chaos,
Yeah.
Kaiser Wilhelm II.
The new Kaiser.
He comes to the throne in 1888. He's young, he's arrogant, he's ambitious, and he thinks Bismarck is a boring old fossil. Wilhelm is a complicated figure. He has a withered left arm from a traumatic birth, and many historians argue this gave him a massive inferiority complex, a need to constantly prove his strength and manliness.
He wants to rule, not just have his chancellor rule for him, the classic conflict, the old master versus the young, impetuous upstart.
And it comes to a head in 1890. Wilhelm essentially forces Bismarck to resign. The dropping of the pilot, as a famous cartoon at the time showed it, and almost immediately, the new regime decides to launch a new course in foreign policy.
A simpler course.
That was the idea. The German Foreign Office looks at Bismarck's web, specifically that secret reinsurance treaty with Russia, and they say, this is too complicated. It's duplicitous. It contradicts our loyalty to our ally, Austria. We should just let it lapse.
And you can just hear the sound of champagne corks popping in the French foreign ministry.
It was arguably the single greatest geopolitical blunder of the late 19th century. From Russia's perspective, Germany has just chosen Austria over them. They feel betrayed, they feel vulnerable, they feel isolated. And who is standing right there with open arms and a very large wallet?
Republican France?
An utterly unlikely partner. I mean, one is the home of revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. The other is the most autocratic monarchy in Europe. Ideologically, they're polar opposites.
But necessity makes for strange bedfellows.
It certainly does. France has the capital that Russia desperately needs to industrialize and build its railways. Russia has the manpower, the famous Russian steamroller, that France needs to threaten Germany from the east. By 1894, the Franco-Russian alliance is signed.
Bismarck's nightmare.
The nightmare of coalitions is now a reality. Germany is officially encircled.
And it's so deeply ironic. By trying to be more straightforward and loyal to Austria, Wilhelm's new course created the very strategic trap that Bismarck had spent 20 years trying to avoid.
And instead of recognizing the danger and trying to de-escalate, Wilhelm and his ministers double down. They lean into it. This is the era of Weltpolitik.
World policy.
Exactly. The old, cautious, Europe-focused policy of Bismarck is out. Wilhelm wants Germany to have a place in the sun. He wants a global empire.
This is where the envy factor comes in, isn't it? He looks across the channel at his grandmother, Queen Victoria, presiding over this vast British empire on which the sun never sets, and he wants a piece of that action. He wants that status.
Precisely. Germany starts aggressively grabbing the colonies that are left over, places like modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon. They muscle their way into China, taking the port of Caucho Bay, and all this activity starts to seriously irritate Britain.
Which had been practicing splendid isolation.
For most of the 19th century, yes. Britain's attitude was, you continental types can squabble all you want as long as it doesn't upset the balance of power too much, and most importantly, as long as nobody challenges our rule of the seas.
But Germany starts poking the lion.
They do. A famous example is the Jameson Raid telegram in 1896. The Kaiser sends a congratulatory telegram to the Boer leader in South Africa for repelling a British raid. The outrage in the UK was immense. It was seen as Germany meddling in the British Empire's private business.
But telegrams are one thing. Nothing pokes the British lion quite like building a massive fleet of battleships. We have to talk about the naval race. This feels like the moment where the rivalry goes from sort of political and colonial to something deeply existential.
It is the absolute turning point in Anglo-German relations. The architect of this policy is a man named Admiral von Tirpitz. He's a brilliant bureaucrat and a naval fanatic, and he convinces the Kaiser and the German parliament to pass a series of huge navy laws starting in 1898.
And his logic is called the risk theory, or Risikogedanke. What's the thinking there?
The thinking is actually quite clever, in a vacuum. Tirpitz argues that Germany doesn't need a navy bigger than Britain's. That's impossible. It just needs a navy that is big enough.
Big enough to be a threat.
Big enough that if Britain ever decided to attack Germany, the Royal Navy would suffer so much damage in the process that it would be left vulnerable to its other naval rivals, like France or Russia. The German fleet would be a deterrent, a fleet in being.
It's a deterrent strategy. Don't mess with me, because even if you win, you'll be so bloodied that someone else will finish you off. I'm too prickly to hug.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
But Tirpitz and the Kaiser completely, catastrophically misread the British psyche. Britain's reaction wasn't, oh, that's a clever theory. I suppose we'd better be nice to Germany now.
They panic.
They panicked. You have to remember, Britain is an island. It imported something like 60% of its food and most of its raw materials. The Royal Navy wasn't just a symbol of imperial glory. It was the lungs of the nation. If the sea lanes were cut, Britain starved. A serious challenge to naval supremacy was a threat to national survival itself.
So Britain's response is to double down.
Massively. They launch a naval revolution. In 1906, they unveil HMS Dreadnought.
Which changes everything.
It's a complete game changer. It's powered by steam turbines, making it faster. It has an all-big gun armament of massive cannons, making its firepower overwhelming. In one fell swoop, the Dreadnought makes every other battleship on the planet, including Britain's own older ships, obsolete.
But here's a question. Didn't that inadvertently help Germany? Because it meant the race basically reset to zero. Now it's a race to build dreadnoughts.
In a purely technical sense, yes, it leveled the playing field for a moment. But in the much more important diplomatic sense, it was an absolute disaster for Germany, because this naval threat was the final straw that pushed Britain out of its splendid isolation.
They start looking for friends.
They realize they can't face this German challenge alone while also feuding with their traditional rivals, France and Russia. So they start mending fences. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale.
Which, we should be clear, wasn't a formal military alliance at first, right? It was more like an agreement to stop arguing over colonies.
Correct. It was basically a colonial real estate deal. The Brits recognized French dominance in Morocco, and the French recognized British dominance in Egypt. You stay out of my backyard, I'll stay out of yours. But it was a huge symbolic step. The two old enemies were finally talking.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And then, the really shocking move comes in 1907. Britain, which had seen Russia as its great imperial rival in Asia for a century, the Great Game, patches things up with them too. The Anglo-Russian Convention settles their disputes over Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet.
And with that, the circle is complete. The Triple Entente is born: Britain, France, and Russia.
So now the board is well and truly set. You have the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in the middle.
Yeah.
Surrounding them, you have the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia.
And from Berlin's perspective, this looks terrifying. This confirms all their worst fears about encirclement.
It creates this intense, paranoid, claustrophobic feeling in the German leadership. And that paranoia drives them to do something very risky, to test the strength of these new friendships, to see if they can bully one member and get the others to back down, to try and break the ring.
Which leads us to a series of pre-war crises that just keep raising the temperature.
They're like dress rehearsals for 1914. Each one brings Europe a little closer to the edge.
Let's start with the Moroccan crises. Germany decides to pick a fight with France over Morocco to test the new Anglo-French Entente.
Yes. In 1905, the Kaiser sails his yacht to Tangier in Morocco. He dramatically rides a white horse through the streets and gives a speech supporting Moroccan independence. This was a direct challenge to France, which considered Morocco to be in its sphere of influence.
He's poking the bear, or the Gallic rooster, I suppose.
He is. The Germans are hoping to show France that its new friend, Britain, is unreliable and won't actually back them up in a crisis. They force an international conference at Algeciras in Spain to settle the issue.
And what happens?
It backfires spectacularly. At the conference, Britain stands rock solid with France. Almost everyone does. The only country that supports Germany is Austria-Hungary.
So Germany ends up looking not strong, but isolated and foolish.
Precisely. And incredibly, they don't learn their lesson. They try it again in 1911.
This is the Agadir crisis, the story of the gunboat Panther.
Gunboat diplomacy in the most literal sense. There are some internal disturbances in Morocco. France sends troops. Germany sees an opportunity and sends a small gunboat, the Panther, to the Moroccan port of Agadir, supposedly to protect German interests.
But the real goal is to bully France into giving them colonial territory elsewhere in the Congo as compensation.
Right. Again, they're trying to split the Entente. And again, the result is the exact opposite. The British get extremely worried that Germany is trying to establish a naval base on the Atlantic coast, which would threaten their trade routes.
So Britain and France draw even closer.
Much closer. After this crisis, they begin secret military staff talks. They start coordinating their naval defense plans. They agree that the French fleet will focus on guarding the Mediterranean, allowing the Royal Navy to concentrate all its strength in the North Sea.
Directly facing Germany.
So every single time Kaiser Wilhelm tries to smash the ring of encirclement, he just ends up welding its links tighter together.
Meanwhile, as all this is happening in North Africa, the original European tinderbox, the Balkans, is getting hotter and hotter. We have to talk about 1908, the Bosnian crisis. This feels like a direct prequel to 1914.
It is the single most important precursor.
Yeah.
Here's what happens. Austria-Hungary decides to formally annex the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Now, they had been occupying and administering them since 1878, but legally, on paper, they were still part of the Ottoman Empire.
Correct. This move to full annexation absolutely enrages the neighboring kingdom of Serbia.
Because Serbia saw Bosnia, with its large Serb population, as rightfully theirs, part of a future Greater Serbia or Yugoslavia.
Exactly. So Serbia protests furiously. They start mobilizing their army, and they call on their big brother, their Slavic protector, Russia, for help.
And Russia, which styles itself the protector of all Slavs, is also outraged.
They are. But Russia is weak. They have just been humiliated in a war with Japan in 1905, a shocking defeat for a European power that nearly caused a full-blown revolution back home. Their army is a mess. Their finances are a wreck. They are in no position to fight a major war.
So what happens?
Germany steps in. In a very famous diplomatic move, the German chancellor stands by Austria in shining armor, as the Kaiser put it. They basically send a message to St. Petersburg saying, if you intervene to help Serbia, you will be at war not just with Austria, but with Germany too.
And Russia has to back down.
They have no choice. They are forced to accept the annexation, and it is a deep, burning national humiliation. And this is absolutely vital for understanding what happens in 1914. The Russian leadership, from the Tsar down, essentially makes a collective vow, never again.
We cannot afford to be humiliated like this a second time.
To do so would mean they cease to be a great power. They began a massive program of military rearmament and railway construction, determined that the next time a crisis comes in the Balkans, they will be ready.
And then, just to pour more gasoline on the fire, we have the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913.
Right, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Montenegro, gets together and effectively drives the Ottoman Empire out of Europe almost completely. They fight amongst themselves over the spoils in a second war.
And what's the key consequence of all this?
The key consequence is that Serbia emerges as the big winner. It more than doubles in size. Its army is now battle-hardened and confident. And Austria-Hungary is now staring at this enlarged, aggressive, nationalistic Serbia on its southern border, a state that is actively trying to stir up the Slavic populations inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
So by the spring of 1914, just before the assassination, let's just take stock of the mindset in each of the great powers.
It's a psychological tinderbox. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian leadership feels their multi-ethnic empire is facing existential collapse from Serbian nationalism. They feel they must crush Serbia to survive.
In St. Petersburg, Russia feels it cannot afford another humiliation in the Balkans. It must stand by Serbia next time or lose all credibility.
In Berlin, the German military leadership is convinced that a major European war is inevitable, and they're looking at Russia's massive rearmament program, which is said to be completed around 1917, and they're thinking, if we have to fight this war, we better do it now before Russia gets too strong.
The famous quote from General von Moltke, "War is inevitable, and the sooner the better."
It's a chilling mentality. And in Paris, they are bound by their alliance to Russia. In London, they are desperately hoping to stay out of it, but are terrified of a German-dominated Europe. Everyone is on a hair trigger. The long fuse is burned all the way down to the powder keg.
Which brings us right back to that street corner in Sarajevo. June 28, 1914. Gavrilo Princip fires those 2 shots. The Archduke and his wife are dead.
Now, in a sane, rational world, maybe this remains a localized issue. An international incident, sure. But Austria is angry at Serbia. Maybe they fight a short, punitive war. But the machinery of the alliances, which has been built up over decades, now begins to grind into motion.
So let's walk through the July crisis. This is the month where diplomacy goes to die. It all starts just a week after the assassination with the blank check, July 5th.
This is the single most critical decision of the entire crisis. An envoy from the Austrian Foreign Ministry, Count Hoyos, travels to Berlin. He meets with the Kaiser and the German Chancellor. He basically asks the question, if we take strong action against Serbia, action that might lead to war with Russia, will you support us?
And Kaiser Wilhelm doesn't hesitate.
No hesitation. He and his chancellor promise Austria-Hungary Germany's full, unconditional support, no matter what they decide to do. It is a blank check.
Why? I mean, why would they hand over the decision for war or peace to the notoriously incompetent government in Vienna? That seems incredibly reckless.
It was a massive calculated risk. The Germans were betting on two things. First, they hoped the conflict could be localized. They genuinely thought that the Tsar of Russia, being a fellow monarch, wouldn't go to war to defend a country, Serbia, that was seen as harboring regicides, people who kill royalty.
They thought they could get away with a quick surgical strike.
A quick Austrian war to punish Serbia, present the world with a fait accompli, done deal, and that would be the end of it. And the second calculation.
The sooner the better.
Exactly. The military high command, led by Moltke, was whispering in the Kaiser's ear. If Russia does intervene, then this is our chance. This is the war we know is coming. Let's fight it now, on our terms, before they're ready.
So armed with this blank check from the most powerful country in Europe, Austria, does nothing. They wait.
They wait for nearly a month, which is just bizarre.
Why the delay? If you're going to strike, you'd think you'd strike while the world is still shocked and sympathetic about the assassination.
There were a few reasons. Part of it was just the slow, creaky nature of the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy. But the main reason, believe it or not, was the harvest.
The harvest.
Many of the soldiers in the army were on harvest leave, sent home to help bring in the crops. The leadership didn't want to disrupt the harvest by mobilizing. This delay proved fatal because it allowed that initial wave of international sympathy for Austria to completely evaporate. By the time they act, they just look like cold, calculating aggressors.
And then finally, on July 23rd, they deliver their ultimatum to Serbia.
A document that Winston Churchill later called the most formidable document ever addressed from one state to another. It was a list of 10 demands, and it was deliberately designed to be impossible for any sovereign nation to accept.
It demanded things like shutting down all anti-Austrian newspapers, arresting certain military officers.
But the real kicker, the one they knew Serbia couldn't accept, was point 6. It demanded that Austrian officials be allowed to operate inside Serbia to participate in the investigation of the assassination plot.
Which is a complete violation of sovereignty. No country could agree to let another country's police run around on their territory.
But Serbia plays it brilliantly. They're desperate to avoid a war, they consult with Russia, and their reply, delivered just minutes before the deadline, is a masterpiece of diplomacy. They accept almost everything.
They accept 9 of the 10 points.
Or they accept them with minor reservations. The only one they flatly reject is point 6, saying it would violate their constitution. They offer to refer it to the International Court at The Hague.
It's an incredibly conciliatory reply. When the Kaiser reads it, he even says, a great moral victory for Vienna. Every reason for war drops away.
But it's too late. The hardliners in Vienna and Berlin have already decided on war. Austria declares that Serbia's reply is not enough. They break off diplomatic relations.
And then the dominoes begin to fall fast.
July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Austrian artillery begins shelling the Serbian capital, Belgrade. Russia cannot let this happen. They remember the humiliation of 1908. The Tsar is under immense pressure from his generals. He orders a partial mobilization just against Austria, but his generals tell him that's technically impossible. The plans only allow for a full mobilization.
And this is where the rigidity comes in, the military timetables. We need to explain why, in 1914, mobilization effectively meant war.
It's because mobilizing an army of millions of men was an incredibly complex logistical operation. It involved thousands of trains, moving hundreds of thousands of troops and tons of equipment, all running on precise, intricate schedules that had been worked on for years.
It's not something you can just pause.
Exactly. Once you press that go button, the whole machine lurches into motion. To stop it halfway would create total chaos and leave your country vulnerable and undefended. It was, as one historian called it, war by timetable.
So Russia orders full mobilization. Germany sees this. What is their play?
Germany's entire war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was built on a rigid set of assumptions. It assumed a two-front war against both France and Russia. But crucially, it assumed Russia would be very slow to mobilize.
The Russian steamroller would take time to get going.
At least 6 weeks, they calculated. So the plan was throw almost the entire German army west, knock France out of the war in a lightning campaign, and then turn around and transport the troops back east to face the slowly mobilizing Russians. Speed was everything.
So the second that Russia starts mobilizing, the clock starts ticking for Germany.
The Schlieffen-Plan's clock. So Germany sends an ultimatum to Russia. Stop your mobilization at once. Russia refuses.
And so because of a timetable, Germany has to attack France, even though France has had almost nothing to do with this crisis so far.
That is the terrible, insane logic of the situation.
Wow.
To defend itself against Russia, Germany must first invade France. And to invade France quickly enough to make the plan work, they have to go through neutral Belgium to bypass the heavy French fortresses.
So on August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. On August 3rd, it declares war on France. And then German troops cross the border into Belgium.
And that is the smoking gun, the invasion of neutral Belgium. Britain had signed a treaty way back in 1839, the Treaty of London, guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. The German chancellor famously and foolishly dismissed it as a mere scrap of paper.
But for Britain, it was both a legal obligation and a vital national interest. They could not allow a hostile great power to control the Belgian channel ports. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declares war on Germany.
And just like that, because of an assassination to Balkan City and a web of rigid alliances and inflexible military plans, almost all of Europe is at war.
It's breathtaking how fast it all happens, from a local crisis to a continental catastrophe in just 5 weeks. And almost immediately, the plans that everyone had so much faith in start to go wrong.
Completely wrong. The Schlieffen Plan fails. The Germans are stopped just short of Paris, the Battle of the Marne in early September. The dream of a short, victorious war dies there.
And the race to the sea begins.
Both armies try to outflank each other, moving north towards the English Channel, but they run out of land. And so, with nowhere else to go, they dig in. And that's the beginning of 4 years of trench warfare.
We so often focus on the fighting itself, on the mud and the battles of the Western Front. But let's look at the broader consequences, the events that actually led to the defeat of the Central Powers. Because it wasn't just bullets that defeated them, it was calories.
Absolutely. We have to talk about the British naval blockade. It's one of the most decisive and often overlooked aspects of the war. Britain uses its superior navy to seal off the North Sea and the English Channel.
Cutting Germany off from the world.
Completely. And Germany was hugely dependent on imports, not just for food, but for crucial raw materials like nitrates, which you need to make both fertilizer for crops and explosives for shells.
I'm looking at some of the numbers from our sources here. By 1918, Germany's imports had fallen to just 25% of their pre-war levels.
It was utterly devastating for the German home front. The most famous period is the turnip winter of 1916-17. The potato crop failed, and the staple food for the entire population became the swede, or rutabaga, a vegetable normally grown as animal fodder.
They were making bread out of sawdust.
Literally. The infamous K-Brot, or war bread, was made with potato flour, rye, and eventually things like dried turnip, straw, and yes, sawdust as filler. The average daily caloric intake for a German civilian plummeted to around 1,000 calories.
That's starvation level.
It is. A German government study right after the war claimed that around 762,000 civilians died from starvation and malnutrition-related diseases as a direct result of the blockade. Now, that figure is debated. Some modern historians argue that the German army's own policy of requisitioning food and horses played a massive role too, but the scale of the suffering is undeniable.
And this suffering at home inevitably starts to change the politics inside Germany.
It shatters the Burgfrieden, the fortress peace. In August 1914, the Kaiser had famously said, "I no longer see parties, I see only Germans." And everyone, even the Socialist Party, the SPD, voted for war credits and supported the national effort.
But by 1916, that unity is completely gone.
It's in tatters. The SPD splits over the continuation of the war. You get the rise of radical far-left groups like the USPD and the Spartacists, led by figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who are openly calling for a socialist revolution to end the war. The home front is collapsing into political chaos.
And Britain is dealing with its own radical changes on the home front, too.
Oh, yes. The British government passes DOR, the Defense of the Realm Act. It gave the state unprecedented powers. They could take over factories and coal mines, censor the press, introduce rationing, and even change the clocks. British summertime was introduced to give factories more daylight hours. It was the end of the old, liberal, laissez-faire Britain.
So bringing it all together, why did the Central Powers actually lose the war? We've got the blockade causing starvation. What were the other key factors?
The fundamental problem was economic disparity. The Allies, thanks to the Royal Navy, had access to the global market. They could buy food and materials from the Americas, from their empires. Germany and Austria were boxed in, slowly being strangled.
And then the game changer. The United States enters the war in 1917.
That's the tipping point. Germany's decision to launch unrestricted submarine warfare, to try and starve Britain in return for the blockade, was a desperate gamble that backfired by bringing the U.S. in.
The sources here note the sheer economic might of the U.S. It provided over $2 billion in loans to the Allies. To Germany, just $27 million.
You simply cannot fight that kind of industrial and financial math. And then there were the troops, the doughboys. By the middle of 1918, fresh, well-fed American soldiers were arriving in France at a rate of 300,000 a month.
At the exact moment, the German army was at its breaking point.
Exactly. The German army was exhausted, starving, and its allies were collapsing. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were literally disintegrating from within. Morale on the German home front was gone. The army's will to fight just broke.
Which leads to the internal collapse. In late October and early November 1918, the sailors of the German High Seas Fleet at Wilhelmshaven mutiny. They refused to go out on a final suicidal mission. That mutiny spreads like wildfire.
It turns into a full-blown revolution. The Kaiser is forced to abdicate and flees to Holland. A republic, the Weimar Republic, is declared in Berlin. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns finally fall silent.
An armistice is signed. But the war is over. Millions are dead. 4 empires are gone. And almost immediately, the finger-pointing begins. The great historical debate. Who was to blame?
And the historiography of this question is a battlefield in itself. The answer has changed dramatically over the last century.
Let's start at the beginning. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles.
The verdict there was simple and brutal. Article 231 of the treaty, the infamous War Guilt Clause. It legally stated that Germany and her allies were 100% responsible for all the loss and damage of the war.
And this was primarily a legal basis for forcing Germany to pay massive reparations.
It was. But for the German people, it was read as a moral condemnation, a dictated peace. And that sense of national humiliation became a core grievance that fueled the rise of extremism in the 1920s and 30s.
Right, so after that initial verdict, you get a backlash, the revisionist school of thought in the interwar years.
Exactly. Historians in Britain and America started to argue that Versailles was too harsh. They looked at the complex web of alliances, the military timetables, the arms race, and their conclusion was essentially, we all slid into it. It was a tragic collective failure of the system. No one nation was solely to blame.
A much more comfortable conclusion. But then, in 1961, a German historian drops an absolute bombshell on this cozy consensus. First Fischer.
The Fischer thesis. It completely revolutionized the debate. Fischer was the first German historian to get access to the complete Imperial German archives, and what he found was explosive.
He found a document called the September Program.
The September Program, from September 1914, just after the war began. It was a memo from the German Chancellor outlining Germany's extensive war aims. They planned to annex huge chunks of France, Belgium, and Russia, and create a German-dominated economic bloc in Central Europe.
So this wasn't just a defensive war that they stumbled into.
That was Fischer's explosive argument. He claimed that the evidence showed that Germany's ruling elite had deliberately provoked the July crisis. They had planned for a major European war in order to achieve world power status Weltmacht, and also to solve their growing domestic political problems with the rise of socialism.
That must have been incredibly controversial in Germany at the time.
It was a firestorm. Fischer was accused of soiling his own nest, of providing ammunition to Germany's enemies. But his meticulous evidence-based argument forced everyone, inside and outside Germany, to reevaluate the question of German responsibility.
So where does the debate stand today? What's the more modern consensus?
I think we've moved back towards a more nuanced middle ground, but a middle ground that has been permanently shifted by Fischer's work. The current standard bearer is probably Christopher Clark's magnificent book, The Sleepwalkers.
The Sleepwalkers metaphor is so powerful. What's his argument?
Clark argues against looking for a single guilty party, a single smoking gun. Instead, he points to a shared political culture of paranoia that existed in all the European capitals. The Austrians were paranoid about national collapse, the Russians about humiliation, the Germans about encirclement, the French about German aggression, the British about the naval threat.
So they weren't evil Bond villains plotting world destruction.
No, he suggests they were anxious, blinkered leaders acting according to a set of assumptions that made their catastrophic decisions seem rational to them at the time. They were, as his title suggests, sleepwalking into a tragedy, blind to the reality of the horror they were about to unleash because they were so obsessed with their own fears and national prestige.
So it wasn't premeditated murder, as Fisher might suggest, but maybe involuntary manslaughter on a massive continental scale.
Or perhaps criminal negligence from all parties. Clark refocuses attention not just on why the war happened, but how. He puts Serbia and Russia back in the picture as more active agents.
It's also interesting to quickly touch on the Marxist view from Lenin.
Right. For Lenin and other Marxists, the whole debate about which country started it was missing the point. For them, the war was the inevitable, structural result of late-stage capitalism. It was a war of imperialist powers fighting over colonies, resources, and markets. The system itself demanded conflict.
So let's try and pull this all together. After walking through this whole story, from Bismarck's juggling act to the mud of the trenches, what's the big takeaway for us today?
For me, it's that systems matter. The international system they had created, this rigid web of alliances, which was meant to create a balance of power and keep the peace, actually did the opposite. It created a transmission belt for war, ensuring that a local conflict in the Balkans would automatically become a global one.
It prioritized rigid commitments over communication and de-escalation.
Absolutely. And it highlights the terrifying danger of letting military timetables dictate diplomatic decisions. The moment the generals said, "Our mobilization plan requires us to move now," the diplomats were pushed aside. The talking stopped because the trains had to start moving. And that is a deeply chilling lesson for our own age.
I want to leave our listeners with a final provocative thought. It comes from the historian Margaret Macmillan. She pushes back against the idea of inevitability. She suggests that there are always choices.
It's a powerful and very human point. We often look back at history and draw these clean lines saying A led to B, which led to C, so the war was inevitable. But was it? What if the Kaiser had listened to his own instincts when he read the Serbian reply and called for a conference? What if the Tsar had found the courage to halt mobilization?
What if any of the leaders in 1914 had possessed the moral imagination to actually visualize what an industrial war would look like? The machine guns, the artillery, the gas.
Could the 20th century have been completely different? No Russian Revolution, no Lenin, no Treaty of Versailles, no Hitler, no Cold War. It's the ultimate what if. And it's a vital reminder that history isn't just a story of abstract forces and dates. It's a story of human beings making decisions or failing to make them in rooms under pressure.
And for you listening, think about our world right now. We still have alliances. We still have arms races. We still have rising powers challenging established ones and a shared culture of paranoia. Are we too sleepwalking?
That is the question we should all be asking ourselves.
On that rather sobering note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of the First World War.
It's always a pleasure to unpack these crucial moments.
We'll see you next time.